On the 11th of September, 1969, in the Nevada desert, a crew of engineers switched off a working nuclear rocket engine for the last time, and then went home. It sat at the far end of a test stand called Engine Test Stand 1, out on the flats about 100 miles northwest of Las Vegas. A slender machine, a little over 20 feet tall, wrapped in insulation and laced with frost from the liquid hydrogen running through it, with a nozzle at the base wide enough for a man to climb into. Over the previous 10 months, it had been started, run, shut down, and started again 24 times. Every one of those runs did what its designers said it would. Its name was XE Prime, and it was the closest thing to a finished nuclear rocket engine the world has ever built. By the time that crew logged the last data tape and locked up the cell, the United States had, sitting in the desert, an engine that its own program office had already judged ready to carry human beings to Mars. 3 years and 4 months later, on the 5th of January, 1973, it was over. The program was terminated by announcement. The engine had never flown, and it wasn't going to. And here's the part that has bugged me through everything I read about this. Nothing had gone wrong. There was no accident, no explosion on the pad, no reactor that melted down, no crew that died. The machine worked. They shut it off anyway. I want to lay out how a finished engine ends up mothballed like that, because it's one of the most bizarre deaths in the American space program, and because it didn't happen once, it happened twice. The nuclear rocket was killed in 1973, brought back from the dead almost 50 years later, and then killed a second time in the spring of 2025. And the two death certificates read almost word for word the same. Each time, the engine itself passed every test put to it. What failed, both times, was something around it. The strange part is that this engine was a dead man walking almost from the beginning. Once you see what it was built to do, and how nearly finished it really was, that only makes it harder to accept. Start with the physics, because the physics is the whole reason anyone spent $1.5 billion on this. A rocket engine throws mass out the back to push itself forward, and the number that tells you how efficiently it does that is called specific impulse. Think of it as gas mileage for rockets. The best chemical engines ever built, the hydrogen and oxygen engines that flew on the Saturn Five and later the shuttle, top out around 450 seconds of specific impulse. That's a hard ceiling, and chemistry itself sets it. You're burning fuel, and there's only so much energy in a chemical bond. A nuclear engine cheats that ceiling. It doesn't burn anything. It runs cold hydrogen through the core of a nuclear reactor, heats it to a few thousand degrees, and blasts it out the nozzle. No combustion, no oxidizer, nothing consumed except the reactor's own uranium, and that lasts for hours. It's less a rocket in the way you picture one than a nuclear blowtorch pointed at a tank of the lightest gas there is. The tested NERVA engines reached about 850 seconds of specific impulse, close to double what chemistry can ever do. In plain terms, a nuclear stage could do the same job as a chemical one on roughly half the propellant, or take you twice as far on the same load. And here's what I didn't appreciate until I read into this. The engine was already controllable in exactly the way a real mission needs. You start and stop a reactor like this by turning drums set into its sides, each drum a neutron reflector on one face and an absorber on the other. Turn them one way and the reaction runs. Turn them back and it stops. That's what let XE Prime start 24 times, and a restartable engine is exactly what a Mars trip demands, because you fire once to leave Earth, coast for months, fire again to slow into orbit around Mars, and fire a third time to come home. The radiation problem had an answer too. A running reactor throws out enough radiation to kill a crew, so the designers put heavy shielding only between the reactor and the astronauts, what they called a shadow shield, and let the crew ride in the cone of protection it cast down the length of the ship. None of it was hand-waving. It was worked out and tested, and by the end very nearly finished. For a trip to Mars, all of that is enormous. On half the propellant, you can fly missions that chemistry leaves stranded on the drawing board. This is why, in the early 1960s, the nuclear rocket wasn't some side experiment. It sat right next to Apollo as one half of the plan. Apollo would get Americans to the moon on chemistry. The nuclear engine would take the step after that, and the step after the moon was Mars. The program had two halves and a stack of names, and they all belonged to one story. There was Project Rover, run out of the Los Alamos lab starting in 1955, which built the reactors. NERVA, the nuclear engine for rocket vehicle application, turned those reactors into an actual flight engine, built under contract by Aerojet and Westinghouse. And the whole thing came together out in the desert at a place with the wonderful, undignified name of Jackass Flats on the Nevada test site, where between 1959 and 1972 they fired 23 reactors in the open air. It was run jointly by NASA and the Atomic Energy Commission, and at its peak, it was a small industrial city of its own. Thousands of people building and firing reactors in a corner of the desert most of the country never knew was there. The scale of that operation still surprises me. They stored the liquid hydrogen in 2 cryogenic tanks, holding around 500,000 gallons each. They assembled the engines and reactors inside a heavily shielded building, then rolled them out to the test stands on a railroad, because the finished article was far too radioactive for anyone to stand near, and everything from that point ran by remote control from behind thick concrete. And some of what they did out there is genuinely hard to believe they were allowed to do. In June of 1968, they ran a reactor called Phoebus 2A, up to 4,000 megawatts of thermal power. For a few minutes, that single reactor was the most powerful nuclear reactor that had ever been built anywhere on Earth. Its exhaust, a column of superheated hydrogen roaring straight up into the desert sky. 3 years earlier, in January of 1965, they'd taken a different reactor, a Kiwi, and deliberately destroyed it. They rammed it to full power in a fraction of a second, on purpose, to see what a runaway nuclear rocket would actually do, and it blew itself apart, vaporizing several hundred pounds of uranium at temperatures around 8,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and drifting a faint radioactive cloud toward Los Angeles. That was not an accident. That was a scheduled test. And I still find that a little staggering, that the plan to keep the whole program safe included destroying a working reactor on a set date, just to be certain they knew how one would come apart. The point of all of it was to wring out every failure mode before an engine ever carried a crew. And it worked. By the late 1960s, the engines were running for nearly 2 hours at a stretch, holding 28 minutes at a time, at full power. Then came XE Prime, the one on the stand that September, built-in flight configuration and firing downward into a simulated vacuum the way a real engine would in space. It started 24 times, and at the end of 1968, the office that ran the program made it official. The engine met the requirements for a crewed mission to Mars, and I want to be clear about what that meant, because it's easy to wave past. A full-size flight engine had already started, run, throttled, shut down, and restarted, over and over, without once braking. That was the thing sitting in the desert. So the setup turns here, and it turns on a date that has nothing to do with engineering. In July of 1969, Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and the moment it did, the reason the nuclear rocket existed began to evaporate. That sounds backwards, so let me be careful with it, because this is the hinge of the whole story. 2 months after the moon landing, in September of 1969, a group called the Space Task Group handed President Nixon a plan for what America should do in space next. Wernher von Braun, the man who had built the Saturn Five, laid out the boldest version of it: a permanent space station, a reusable shuttle, and, riding the nuclear engine as its upper stage, a crewed landing on Mars as early as 1981. In that plan, NERVA was the one piece that was already finished. Everything else, the station, the shuttle, the ships, still had to be built. The engine was ready and waiting. Nixon looked at the plan, and he didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. He simply left it unanswered. For nearly 6 months he said nothing at all, and then, more than 2 years later, he approved exactly one piece of the whole ambitious thing: the space shuttle. The Mars mission was never funded. It wasn't formally killed either. It just quietly stopped being something anyone was going to do. And this is the moment I keep coming back to, because it's the real point of no return, and it lands years before the program officially died. The nuclear engine was built to be a Mars upper stage. In September of 1969, the Mars mission it existed for went away. From that instant, the engine was a bridge to a destination that no longer existed. It was finished, tested, ready, and pointed at nothing. Everything after that was the paperwork catching up to a decision that had already been made in silence. You can watch that catch up, and it's a slow, undramatic thing. Funding for the nuclear rocket started sliding in the late 1960s, and one detail tells you it was never really about whether the machine was good. Congress kept trying to save it. In the final budget cycle, lawmakers appropriated $100 million to keep a smaller version of the engine alive. The administration terminated it regardless. The layoffs began immediately. The program office, the Space Nuclear Propulsion Office, was shut down that June. By the time the announcement came in 1973, the outcome had been settled for more than 3 years. The people still running tests in the desert were, in a real sense, maintaining a machine for a trip that had already been called off. They just hadn't been told to stop yet. After 17 years and around $1.5 billion, the whole effort was folded up, and the men in the desert went looking for other work. Now, I want to be fair to the people who turned it off, because this kind of story falls apart the second you go looking for a villain, and there isn't one here. Put yourself in the administration's chair in 1971. Apollo has already won. The public that was riveted by the moon has moved on, and the appetite for another decade-long, multi-billion-dollar space epic is simply gone. The country is spending heavily on a war and a great many things at home, and a crewed Mars mission meant far more than the engine. It meant the ships, the years, the risk, the whole enormous architecture around one finished part. Nixon was reluctant even so, in part because cancellation would put as many as 20,000 people out of work, most of them in California, a state he wanted to carry in the 1972 election. None of that is the reasoning of a fool or a coward. It's roughly what any careful person does with a real budget and no mission left to spend it on. Every link in this chain holds up on its own, and that's exactly what makes it so bleak. Because what they turned off was a finished engine, ready to be built into a spacecraft. And I think if you'd told those engineers that the machine they'd spent their careers proving would sit in the desert, pass every test, meet the Mars requirement, and then get switched off, not for failing but because there was no longer anywhere to send it, they'd have said it made no sense. And they'd have been right. There was no engineering case for shutting it down, only a budget case, and in 1973 the budget case was the one still standing. That gap between what the machine could do and what the country was willing to do with it is what this whole story is about. For a while, that looked like the end of it. It wasn't, and this is where the story does something I didn't expect, because a dead engine is supposed to stay dead, and this one refused to. In the 1980s, the idea came back. Under the Strategic Defense Initiative, the missile defense push everyone called Star Wars, a classified program called Timberwind, looked again at nuclear rockets, this time with a different reactor design. It ran for a few years, near the end of the decade, spent over $100 million, and then went quiet when the Cold War it was built for ended. The engine went back in its box. Then, in January of 2023, it came out again, and this time with real intent. NASA and DARPA, the Pentagon's Advanced Research Agency, announced a joint program called DRACO, the demonstration rocket for agile cislunar operations. This wasn't another ground test in the desert. The plan was to finally do the one thing NERVA never got to do: build a nuclear thermal engine, put it on a rocket, and fly it in space before the end of the decade. $500 million, a real flight, the thing the engineers in 1969 had been ready to do, more than 50 years late. I'll admit, when I first read about DRACO, I let myself believe this was the comeback, that the machine that had been too good for its own era had finally outlived the politics that killed it, and was about to fly. The physics had never changed, the engine had always worked. All it had ever needed was a mission and a budget at the same moment. For the first time in half a century, it had both. And then, in the spring of 2025, they killed it again. This second cancellation is the one I keep turning over, and it's a little hard to sit with. On the 30th of May, 2025, the finalized federal budget request for 2026 zeroed it out, and not only DRACO, it zeroed all of the nuclear thermal propulsion work and the nuclear electric work beside it. And when DARPA explained why, the reason wasn't that the engine had failed. The engine was fine. The reason was that the world around the engine had shifted underneath it. In the years since DRACO was conceived, the cost of simply launching mass into space had collapsed, driven mostly by SpaceX and its reusable rockets. A DARPA official pointed straight at what he called the precipitous decrease in launch costs. If getting fuel to orbit becomes cheap enough, the whole advantage of an engine that sips fuel starts to shrink, and the case for a complicated radioactive machine gets harder to make. Read that reason back against 1973 and tell me it isn't the same sentence. In 1973, the engine worked and the mission around it went away. In 2025, the engine worked and the economics around it went away. Neither time did the machine fail. Both times, the thing it was attached to, the destination, the budget, the business case, was what dissolved. The nuclear rocket has now been declared ready twice and canceled twice across 52 years, and in all that time, it has never once been allowed to simply fail. So let me be direct about why this engine keeps dying, because the reasons are worth naming, and they aren't the reasons you usually hear. The first reason is the biggest, and it's the one most people get wrong. The instinct is to assume it must have been the danger, or some hidden failure. It was neither. The engine was a solution built years ahead of its problem, and the problem kept getting canceled out from under it. NERVA was an answer to a question. How do we get people to Mars? That the country asked loudly in 1962 and then mostly stopped asking by 1970. Once the destination was gone, the engine had nowhere to go and nothing to be. None of this was ever really about the machine. It was about whether the country still wanted the place the engine was built to reach. Second, the engine's value was never absolute. It rose and fell with one thing outside the engine entirely: the cost of getting to orbit. A nuclear engine is only worth the trouble if launching fuel the ordinary way is expensive, and that was obviously true in the 1960s, and still true in 2023, and then it quietly stopped being true. Cheap, reusable launch is the kind of rival that erases a harder technology without ever beating it in a test, just by making the test beside the point. Third, and this one genuinely counts against it, and I won't pretend it away. A nuclear engine is a hard machine to love, politically. In the test years it ran on what was effectively bomb-grade uranium. It throws out lethal radiation while it fires and stays dangerously radioactive after it stops. You can engineer around all of that, and the designers did, but every one of those facts is a reason for a nervous budget office to reach for the pen. The engine's own nature made it easy to cancel and hard to defend. And the fourth is simple: it never flew. A machine that stays on the ground never builds the constituency that keeps it alive. A rocket with a launch record has contractors, states, jobs, a flight heritage, momentum behind it. NERVA had a perfect test record in an empty desert and nothing in the sky. So when the budget knife came, twice, there was nothing flying to defend. And notice what isn't on that list: a fault in the engine. All four reasons are about the world around it, never the machine itself. I don't want to leave you with the idea that killing it was obviously the wrong call, because the honest picture is messier than that, and the mess is the point. There's a real argument, and I think it deserves to be heard, that both cancellations were correct. In 1973 there genuinely was no money and no public will for a crewed Mars program, and pouring more into a Mars engine with no Mars mission would have been throwing good money after a decision already made. And in 2025, if launch really is getting cheap enough, then maybe the smart move really is to spend the nuclear money on the reactors we'll need on the surface of the Moon and Mars, which is in fact where that 2026 funding went, rather than on a thermal engine to get us there. There's also the plain fact that this was never a perfect machine waiting only on permission. Storing liquid hydrogen, which sits at hundreds of degrees below zero for the long months of a Mars voyage, is genuinely hard, and it's a problem we still haven't cleanly solved. I can hold all of that and still find the whole thing sad. The people who made these calls weren't wrong to make them, and there's no mistake here to point at, which is the hard part. A working machine can be entirely real, entirely finished, and still turn out to be the wrong answer at the moment somebody finally asks the question. That's the lesson I keep taking from this, and it isn't a comfortable one. We like to assume that if a thing works, and works better than the alternative, it wins, that good technology finds its moment. The nuclear rocket is the counterexample. By the numbers, it was roughly twice as efficient as the chemistry we actually flew to the moon, and it has spent more than half a century as the best engine we never launched. Working better than the alternative was never the deciding thing. The money, the mission, and the will all had to sit in the same room at the same moment, and across 3 separate tries and 52 years, for the nuclear rocket they never once did. Jackass Flats is still out there. The test stands remain in the Nevada desert, too contaminated to casually tear down, pointing at a sky none of their engines ever reached. The reactors are long gone, but if you want to stand in front of one of these engines, you can. There's a NERVA engine bolted down inside a hall at the Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, among the other rockets, and school groups walk past it every day. It's a plain-looking thing, a nozzle and some plumbing, and nothing on it tells you that it was built to carry people to another planet, that it passed every test it was ever given, and that it was switched off, twice, by people who weren't wrong. It just sits there, cold, in the air conditioning. More than 60 years after the first one lit in the desert, no nuclear engine has ever flown a single mission in space. The deeper thing I take from all of this, I think, is that the graveyard of technology isn't full of failures. It's crowded with things that worked, and arrived at the wrong time, and waited for a moment that never came. That's really why I keep making these videos. A machine that got shelved while it was still running perfectly usually has a stranger story behind it than the ones that launched on schedule, and there are a lot more of them out there than most people realize. So if you want to keep digging them up with me, subscribe, and I'll keep bringing them back out of the desert.